Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200. I'm your co-host, Jason Lee Guthrie. On today's episode, I talk with Chris Lynch about an understudied early Foster composition entitled Where is Thy Spirit, Mary? Chris is head of the Theodore M. Finney Music Library at the University of Pittsburgh and has done extensive work in the Center for American Music, helping to preserve and catalog primary sources related to Stephen Foster. He is a music historian with expertise on topics ranging from 19th century popular song to opera and early Black gospel music. His most recent book is Formulating Foster, Stephen C. Foster and the Creation of a National Musical Myth. So you have made a career out of American music, early American music, not only researching Stephen Foster, but that has been a focus. In your research on Stephen Foster, you have explored his early years, which is, I think it's fair to say, it's a relatively neglected aspect. So I'm interested to learn more about his family life, and maybe in particular what his musical education would have been like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the reasons it's been underexplored by scholars is because we are really limited with the sources that are available. And a big portion of my work has been looking at the history, the provenance of the documents that we do have and how they came to us. There were all sorts of forces shaping the archive. And a big force was the family themselves. They really curated what was preserved and then made available to researchers. And there's not that much that's available that sheds much light on his early life. One document that really comes to mind is his mother's diary. And in it, she has all sorts of interesting stories about Stephen Foster's sisters, about his brothers. There are anecdotes about his sisters performing music in the parlor. One wealthy gentleman came and sat on the piano bench next to one of his sisters and was flirting with her. So we have this scene of courtship. Nothing came of it, but it was still a common parlor scene. She's playing the piano and they're singing songs, flirting with each other. We get little glimpses like that as to what his life might have been like. But one thing that's really interesting is that in that document, the diary, there is no mention of Stephen Foster. And there are pages missing, and it's just very interesting. Why was Stephen Foster removed from that document? We'll never know. But it creates a big hole in our knowledge about his early life. We do know from some of the family letters that his father had a violin and would play tunes for the family. We know that from a young age, he was learning the guitar. His older sisters played the guitar and taught him. And we get other little glimpses. We know that at some point he didn't have a piano in his family's house. So we would go to his neighbor's house and play her piano. And we get these little glimpses, but not a lot of rich detail. His brother Morrison, writing over 30 years after his death, wrote that he studied the music of the masters, and he refers to Beethoven and Mozart. That's probably an exaggeration. He certainly was familiar with the popular tunes of Beethoven that were in piano sheet music that were circulating in the United States. But I think that was about the extent of it. I think that these glimpses that we get through the family letters and through these scenes with his sisters paints the picture of a typical family parlor musical life, typical for a white middle-class family like his of the time period.
How about the racial aspect of the music he would have been exposed to, especially locally in Pittsburgh? Oh, Susanna comes out in the late 1840s. His songs that come out in dialect are a couple of years after that. But he didn't invent that genre. He didn't invent blackface minstrelsy. So would he have encountered that in childhood as well?
Definitely. And it's a great question. It was being invented. The early histories of it are somewhat murky, but it was certainly being invented. One of the places it was being invented was by performers along the Ohio River towns, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Louisville. And all of these performers, Nelson Knies, the Sable Harmonists, they were coming through Pittsburgh and performing, and Foster was hearing their music and was definitely very influenced by it. So he's exposed to the sentimental parlor music, the popular Beethoven and Mozart melodies on the one hand, and then also this more raucous, boisterous, overtly racist music of the minstrel stage on the other hand. One of the other glimmers that we get into his young musical life is a reminiscence that appeared in the newspaper in Pittsburgh in the 1890s. In it, these people that had, as children, performed blackface minstrel songs with Foster described their early efforts, really just as kids playing. This wasn't anything professional or anything like that. But they would put on blackface minstrel skits for their families and friends. Foster's earliest songs were probably written for that, as well as for the parlor, too. So from the very beginning, he was exposed to these two musics and writing these two types of songs as well. Oh, Susanna was published in 1848. He had probably written it much earlier in that decade. Probably, my guess, there's no real evidence of this, but my guess is he probably originally wrote that song for these performances among friends.
I want to talk to you about a specific song that you've researched, relatively obscure in Foster's catalog. It's called Where's Thy Spirit, Mary? Was that song written with someone specific in mind? What's the social context of Foster's daily life in the 1840s when he writes this song?
Yeah, it's a really rich song. I don't know that I would call it personally one of the best Foster songs, but it really is another one of these windows into his life. He wrote it before he was a professional songwriter. This was before he had signed contracts with publishing companies. He had published a couple songs, but he did not see himself as a professional songwriter. It was a hobby. And he wrote this in response to the death of a close friend of his named Mary Keller. They were good friends. They lived just across the river from each other. He could take a short little canoe taxi ride across the river and then a short walk from there to her house. She was one of the people who had a piano that he liked to play. So he would go over there frequently. She had an older sister named Rachel who married one of Stephen's good friends. So he would go over there a lot, and they had what appears to be a rich musical relationship. He dedicated an earlier song to her, There's a Good Time Coming, and that was published in October 1846. About 2 months later, she very suddenly and unexpectedly fell ill and passed away. Very unexpected. It obviously really affected Stephen and his friends. And he wrote this song, Where is Thy Spirit, Mary, in memory of her. He gave it to her sister, Rachel, as a personal gift. This was not a song that he published. This was a very personal song. He gave it to Rachel. It stayed with her for 50 years, and nobody else knew about the song, maybe a couple of friends, but nobody beyond that. And at that point, as Rachel was older, she, I think, started to feel like it belonged somewhere else. She did sell the song. It was published at that time. And now the song has found its way into the Foster Archive at the University of Pittsburgh. So that's a bit about the song. I think it provides a really interesting window into his young life and social circles.
In the absence of a more robust set of historical primary sources, Foster is one that very famous, very influential, but a relative lack of sources, oftentimes from direct family intervention. So we have to kind of work backwards from some of the songs. And that's a really interesting aspect, I think, of what you've done in some of your research. If we look at the difference in style and content and audience between a song like Where's Thy Spirit, Mary, and Oh, Susanna, which was his first hit, or something in dialect like Ring de Banjo that we don't remember as much today, but was certainly very popular at the time. From like a musicology perspective, what's the value in studying these early compositions? What can it tell us about the career that Foster would go on to have, to be able to pull from these competing sources and influences that he had in his younger years?
I think there are a couple of things we can take away from it. One is that this song helps us understand Foster's musical world in a better way, the way that he saw the world. We often talk of him as the father of American music, as if he just invented this out of nothing. But of course, he was just a young man when he wrote this song. In the world, absorbing everything around him, living his life, all of that influenced what he did. And I think this song, both because of the really personal elements and then also because of what sources he draws on stylistically in it, it really helps us understand that world better. He's not drawing here on the minstrel tradition, that tradition that was often referred to as just noisy music. He's drawing on European traditions in this song. And there's one song in particular, a song by a composer named Vincenzo Bellini, who's remembered today mostly as an opera composer, but also wrote a lot of these short songs. Foster draws on a song by Bellini that he actually paraphrases the melody in his song, Where is Thy Spirit, Mary? The Bellini song is Vaga Luna. It remains a very famous Bellini song. Vaga Luna, beautiful moon. And it's about this man who's looking at the moon and imagining a love of his who's far off. They're separated, but they could be looking at the same moon. He asks the moon to convey a message to her. He says, tell her that with so much distance, my grief can never be soothed, that if I have any hope, it is only for the future. Tell her that day and night I count the hours of my longing, and that a sweet hope comforts me in my love. I think that text itself speaks to why it spoke to Foster at this time. He's obviously removed from Mary. He will never see her again. He's grieving her loss. But I think there's also a really telling lyric in his own song, in Where is Thy Spirit, Mary? His first verse reads, Where is thy spirit, Mary? Dwells it in the air? Friends thou hast forsaken, fondly deem 'tis lingering there. And here's the key, I think. He writes, I heard an old-time ballad, low and plaintive was the strain, so pure and clear I seem to hear thy gentle voice again. So he actually writes these lyrics about hearing an old song that reminds him of Mary, almost brings her back. She's almost present again. It's the classic story of the power of music. And it's at that moment in the song that he was very closely to Bellini's melody. He actually includes all of the notes of Bellini's melody, but stretches out the rhythm a little bit, changes the rhythm, adds one note in between, changes it just enough so that it doesn't sound exactly like Bellini. It actually sounds like the memory of hearing maybe Mary singing that song. It's this really beautiful moment. It's gone unnoticed by even scholars until now. But I think that definitely Rachel, Mary's older sister, who Foster gave this song to, she would have known that reference. It's this highly personal reference. They probably all sang this song together. Mary probably sang them this song. It's this really beautiful moment. So I think it does shed light on his social circle, on their relationships, on what music meant to all of them. I also think that it helps us understand Foster's musical influences and the musical world that he was operating in, or that I guess he would soon be operating in as a professional. At this point, he's just a consumer of these songs and he's writing them and singing them with his friends. But soon he's going to begin incorporating these musical styles, melodic gestures into his own music. He's drawing on European classical music, art song in his music that he's writing here. And I think also then when we think about how Foster's style shifts when he becomes a professional songwriter, it shifts a little bit more away from minstrelsy and toward these sentimental, more sort of international style songs. And I think one of the things he's most famous for is shifting minstrelsy itself toward that style. When he became a professional songwriter, his publisher told him to write what would be popular. And there was a lot of anxiety about minstrel music being too overtly sexual or too racist or too controversial in any number of ways. He softened it by writing minstrel songs that were in this musical style. Many of the texts are still highly offensive or maybe less directly offensive, but still offensive. But they're in this more sentimental style. And they're minstrel songs expressing feelings like love and longing to reconnect with a lost loved one, like we see in Where's Thy Spirit, Mary? So I think that we see Foster learning these lessons in these years in these songs. Where's Thy Spirit, Mary? Helps us see that. His other early songs like Oh, Susanna helps us see that other side. And ultimately, it all comes together in his music pretty early on in the 1849, 1850, when he becomes a professional songwriter.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jenny Lightwise Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.